far as I know.
Yeah. There we go.
Just blank it out. You bring it back. Do you control whether it goes to the screen, or do they do that back there?
They do it back there. Good. What do you bring up the next?
Did you do that?
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Leo Hickman. I'm the editor of the Carbon Brief website, and we report on climate science and energy and climate policy in the UK, EU, and all the way around the world. And I'm going to be moderating this afternoon's event. And the title of the event is Fossil Fuel Supply and Climate Policy, Key Steps to Enhance Ambition. And this event is being put on jointly between the Stockholm Environment Institute, Overseas Development Institute, and Oil Change International. And we've got 4 presentations, and then we're going to have 3 discussions before we move it out to Q&A. We've got about an hour and a half, and then straight afterwards, we've got some refreshments being served outside. So just to sort of quickly introduce the theme of today, we are obviously here at COP22 in Morocco, a year or a bit less than a year after the sort of landmark deal that was secured in Paris. And in the lead up to that, we had the IPCC 5th assessment report, which really cemented and really sort of steered the UNFCCC's process into the idea of carbon budgets. And in Paris, we obviously had the agreement over the well below 2 degrees C, or in pursuance of 1.5. And that is, putting it mildly, a stretch target. And the takeaway from that is, as the IPCC clearly showed, is that we need to move off fossil fuels, certainly by the end of this century, ideally a lot sooner, in terms of meeting that well below 2 degrees target. So it's essentially going to mean keeping a lot of the fossil fuel reserves in the ground, the very familiar refrain of keep it in the ground. And this event is going to bring together a really impressive, diverse mix of sort of experts to sort of go through what the policy implications might be for addressing fossil fuel supply. We hear about demand management, but this is crucially about supply, and how all these energy strategies are aligned with both our climate targets and also our sustainability goals, the SDGs. So I'm going to hand over to Michael Lazarus, the Centre Director of the US Centre of the Stockholm Environment Institute, to kick off with the first presentation. Okay, over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Leo. Okay, good. Go back a slide. Make sure you're all in the right place. Good. And I'm going to give a few opening remarks. And as with many events over the past 2 days, it's impossible to begin to talk about this without mentioning the elephant in the room. Conditions have changed since we prepared this panel, since we prepared our presentations. And we've been thinking, and it's still early in the game. So view this as a perspective from a few weeks ago, and a perspective that still rings true. And the strategies by which we go about this question of addressing fossil fuel supply, the missing part, in a sense, of the equation for some time, will change. And we're not sure quite how, but many of the things we're going to talk about, I think you're going to see, still are as relevant or more relevant than they were before. And particularly the equity dimension, which we'll get to a little bit today, and there's another side event tomorrow that gets to it. So, 3 main messages that I would like to get across to open this session. One, first, that investment in fossil fuel production needs to be aligned with the Paris Agreement. The goals of keeping warming well below 2 degrees, perhaps 1.5. Well, that may seem obvious, but very little discussion has gone into the question of how much we invest on the supply side. Most of it has been in terms of the solution space, as it should be. But we need to pay attention. And the divestment movement, many of you I see in this room have been involved in raising this question for some time. But still, it doesn't get the attention it deserves. And there are policies and measures that we have at their disposal that could help to constrain fossil fuel extraction and exploration. And they offer important complements to traditional demand-side climate policy that seeks to constrain our consumption in various ways. We can price the supply side. We can limit the supply side. And together with those traditional levers of carbon pricing and emissions trading and regulation and so forth and incentives, it can make a more potent mix. And we'll talk about that. And fundamentally, and why we're sort of here today to discuss this, is that they need to be integrated into national strategies and into the UNFCCC process. And I'll get to that in a moment, and how. All right? So for those of you, some of you, this will be quite familiar. The fact that this is not an issue that just research and other NGOs have been talking about. Leaders in this area from the IEA and OECD, amongst others, have recognized this well. Since 2013, a couple of really important statements. One that from Fatih Birol, Executive Director of the International Energy Agency, that 2/3 of proven reserves of oil, gas, and coal have to be left undeveloped for a 2° C pathway. Hearing that from the International Energy Agency was a revelation. So too was a very interesting speech given by OECD Secretary General Angel Gurria back in 2013 as well, who remarked that governments everywhere on behalf of their citizens have major stakes in bringing fossil fuel to market. He coined this term carbon entanglement that cannot easily be undone. And that is the lock-in not just of our economic, but our political systems. And again, that rings back to what we saw 2 days ago. It's not just the leaders, there's been a history of these studies, and I will turn it over to Greg Mutted in a moment, who has added to this sort of arc of studies, and his study really nicely describes that. There's a great little box in there. And perhaps one of the more prominent studies in that regard was the work of Carbon Tracker Institute back in 2011, which coined the term unburnable carbon. Many of you are probably familiar with that term now. It entered the discourse. Another famous researcher, Justin Bieber, wait a second. Bill McKibben used that analysis to help build his discussion of do the math, of the terrifying new math of global warming. And in the peer-reviewed literature, we've seen an emergence of some very important studies. Here you see, you're not expected to read from there, the work of Christoph McGlade and Paul Eakins, who characterized the geographic distribution of fossil fuels that need to be left in the ground if we're to reach 2° C. That Arctic and most oil sands have no role in a future, at least one that is cost-effective at 2 degrees, as well as work that others have done on issues like carbon lock-in. So while the unburnable carbon discussion has been very important for financial markets and discussions there about risks of stranding, and we're not talking just about stranding financial assets, we're also talking about stranding communities. Communities like communities in West Virginia and North Dakota that played a role in what we saw on Tuesday. As well as the flip side, which is carbon lock-in, which is the risk if we continue to invest at the levels we've seen in fossil fuel production and extraction, it becomes much harder to move away from it. It reduces the costs of production. It ties in communities, political and economic systems, as well as financial ones too. And even though we've seen a dip recently in oil and gas investment because of low oil prices, the IEA projects it will continue at $750 billion a year out through the next 2 decades. So national climate policies, in a sense, have had blinders on, one could say, as well as the UNFCCC process, only on the demand side of the equation, or largely on the demand side equation. How do we change that? Well, interestingly, over the past year, we've had an interesting dialogue that my colleague Pete Erickson will talk about in the US around the fate of federal lands that are owned by the US government and leased out for production of 40% of the US's coal, a quarter of all the fossil fuels. And there's been a discussion about how we revisit that for various reasons. The American taxpayer getting a fair deal. Are we evaluating this in terms of what it means in terms of our obligation for a declining trajectory for fossil fuel production that's required? And amidst this as well, China now has a moratorium on new coal mines. Indonesia adopted them as well. So majority of the world's coal producers have moratoria on new infrastructure. Not, of course, primarily for climate reasons, because of the carbon market, but it shows some of the levers that can be used. And there's more levers. Levers that are gaining interest and traction, policies and measures that can constrain extraction and exploration. One is this idea of climate testing. When there's a new investment, a new pipeline, a new permit for an export terminal, is it consistent with a 2-degree trajectory? And methods have been developed now to begin to assess that, yes or no, from an economic as well as an equity perspective. Limits, as we just talked about, on exploration and production need not be a complete moratorium, but it can direct it to specific areas that do not play a role in a 2-degree future. Iveta is going to speak in a moment about the removal of producer subsidies and the role that it can play, a prominent issue that has not received adequate attention. Fees and royalties on production or exports. Research is going on in a number of contexts on those issues, including compensation for those who leave their reserves in the ground. And my colleague Pete and I also did a paper about how this is also, it's not just another sort of lever to pull, but one that can fit in a mix of demand and supply measures to enhance effectiveness as well as economic efficiency, if done well. If done well. So it's important to understand, we need to understand the role that these kinds of policies and measures can play. We need to design them to interact correctly and well with other regulations and policies and pricing. And we need to be very mindful of the equity and just orderly transitions. The need for a just orderly transition for the communities most affected, north and of course in the south. And so tomorrow, Greg is going to moderate. My colleague Shimon Karth, who's in the audience somewhere, has assembled a terrific panel to discuss this question of who decides and how is it decided which fossil fuels can be used and which cannot. Do we leave it to the market to decide? Or are there equity principles? Is the right to extract a right to development? Is it a right to pollute? And in what context? So look forward to seeing you, as many of you as possible, in the green zone, okay? In the green zone, 5 o'clock tomorrow, Lucas room. So finally, what is it that parties should consider in terms of how to recognize, track, and support supply-side strategies? Well, first of all, we have a 6th assessment report coming up, and there's a lot of literature growing out there on the role of supply-side activities and constraints, all the way from divestment to moratoria. We need to make sure that makes it in to the IPCC report. NDCs. I mean, imagine an NDC in the future that include language such as, under fairness and ambition, we commit to a declining schedule of fossil fuel production consistent with keeping global warming below 2 degrees, leaving room for other countries to extract. We haven't seen anything like that, but imagine a future NDC that also included domestic policies and measures, such as a limit on further permitting and new leases, removal of subsidies for fossil fuel production. There are a few in there for removal of consumer subsidies, nothing on production subsidies, even though countries have moved towards that. So those are the kinds of things that we can look for in the future process of NDCs. And of course, this process that countries are expected to deliver in terms of long-term strategies. What about a line there for expected production under a 2-degree scenario? And finally, we need to know how to account for the actions that countries take. If I limit my supply, am I contributing to the global commons here? How do we track that? because it may show up in reduced consumption in another country, especially in a globalized oil market. So we need to begin to think about that. We don't need to make it too complicated, but there are things that can be done on all these levels. And I'll leave you with that thought as I turn the panel over to those who will dig a little bit deeper into some of these strategies. And of course, Greg, who's going to give us a broad overview of the issue from a new perspective. So thank you so much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Michael. Going straight over to Greg Muttick, who's a senior campaign advisor at Oil Change International. Over to you, Greg.
So I'm going to speak about the first of the points that Michael made, which is what level of fossil fuel production is consistent with the Paris goals. I'm going to speak about science and rational collective behavior, both of which feel a little strange to be talking about given the events of the last 2 days. It's all the more important to do so, not only because we're going to, all of us, have to work that much harder in the coming years, but also when we think about the collision of the impacts of climate change with the kind of base politics that led to the election of Donald Trump, and which we're seeing in many other countries as well, including mine. We need to work hard to slow down climate change and also to combat that politics. What I'm going to do in this presentation is briefly share with you some research that we in Oil Change International released together with our partner organizations a few weeks ago. And we wanted to ask this question of what do the Paris goals mean for fossil fuel production? Our starting point was to use the carbon budgets that have been published by the IPCC. Now, the Paris goals, well below 2 degrees, aiming for 1.5 degrees. The well below 2 degrees partly reflects our current scientific understanding that 2 degrees and beyond is a lot more dangerous than previously thought. It's a limit which we have to strenuously defend. And on that basis, we believe that those scenarios that talk about a 50% probability of staying below 2 degrees, such as the International Energy Agency's 450 scenario, are not appropriate. That's not an appropriate level of confidence to avoid those dangers. In our analysis, we used the largest probability that the IPCC publishes, which is 66%. Arguably, we would prefer a lot higher, but we did use the 50% probability of hitting 1.5 degrees. Now, that top line is the budgets from the fifth assessment report, from the synthesis report. We took off the emissions that have occurred since then, which gives us a bit more than 800 gigatons of carbon dioxide that can be emitted over the entire future of the fossil fuel industry, if we're going to have a likely chance of staying below 2 degrees, and less than 400 gigatons that can be emitted to have a chance of 1.5 degrees. For comparison, current emissions of carbon dioxide are about 40 gigatons per year. So here you see those two budgets shown in a graph. Now, as Michael mentioned, the known and economically extractable reserves of oil, gas, and coal considerably exceed these amounts that we can afford to burn. We know that through the work of Carbon Tracker, through Bill McKibben's article, and so on. And increasing science that is focusing on this question, including in the IPCC report. What we decided to do was to think about, well, what about the stuff that's already there, that's already locked in? How much are the reserves that are in oil fields, gas fields, coal mines that are already producing, where the wells have been drilled, where the pits have been dug, the pipelines built, and so on, where capital has been invested? That's this bar on the left. And what it tells you is even if we developed no new coal mines, oil fields, or gas fields, The oil, gas, and coal just in the existing fields would take us beyond 2 degrees C. This leads us to quite a different understanding of what needs to happen in the fossil fuel industry. The old saying goes, when you're in a hole, you should stop digging. Now, using this chart, we can illustrate what would happen if more coal mines, oil fields, and gas fields are developed. What they will do is they will add to the column on the left. And that can only have two consequences. The first is if they're fully extracted to their full extent, then it will take us much further beyond 2 degrees C. Or if they're developed and somehow we do manage to stay below 2 degrees C or arrive at 1.5, then anything above those bars becomes stranded assets. And we go through a very rapid, we would have to go through a very rapid decision where a lot of money is lost, there's significant impact on our economies, and a lot of jobs are lost. I've just noticed, by the way, apologies for the way those red lines have slipped down this. So when we look at this chart, what we conclude is that the only reasonable way forward is to stop exacerbating the problem, to stop developing new oil mines, new oil fields, new coal mines, new gas fields, and begin a managed decline of the fossil fuel industry. That managed decline can take place over 2 or 3 decades as the resources in those existing fields and mines are wound down. We need to rapidly expand renewable energy to take their place. That's within a timescale that is feasible, although ambitious. We need to consider the equity aspects of this. As Michael mentioned, we'll be discussing that further tomorrow in the event in the Green Zone. But importantly, and especially importantly, given what's happened this week, this transition has to happen in a way that takes care of the rights both of workers in the fossil fuel industry and communities that depend on fossil fuels. Because of these politics that are shaping today, the just transition away from fossil fuels becomes more important than ever. And through a managed decline, we believe that's the way that can be achieved. I'm going to show you briefly where we're talking about. This is the front line of where new fossil fuels, or the largest quantities of new fossil fuels, need to be stopped. Firstly, coal, you see the importance of the USA, Russia, Australia. When you look at oil and gas, you see that the USA, again, has the largest portion of oil, followed by Canada. Russia, again, features when you add in gas, along with Qatar and Iran. But what we're saying is not just these, but all new developments need to be stopped so that we can undergo a managed decline. These are just the largest that I'm pointing out. This is what it would look like if you just take the oil and gas from existing fields and allow it to decline over time. Again, it looks ambitious, but not impossible. We're talking about halving in the next 15 to 17 years. And the final point I want to make is that I'm obviously not the first person who said we need to keep it in the ground. That message is being articulated by movements around the world who are becoming increasingly effective, and in many cases are succeeding in stopping new fossil fuel developments. When we talk about the role of supply side in climate policy, one great advantage of the supply side is that it is an approach that naturally lends itself to the building of movements, in contrast to some of the more esoteric aspects of climate policy. Given what's happened this week, the role of movements is going to be more important than ever, both in driving the move away from fossil fuels and in doing what we can to reverse the politics that we've seen in action this week. Thanks very much.
Very much for that, Greg. we're obviously absolutely thrilled there's so many of you in here, and it's really a packed room. But I know everyone's sitting down, there's a few people at the back, but there are still quite a lot of empty seats if people want to shuffle onto those, make use of them. So Iveta is a senior researcher at Global Subsidies Initiative, International Institute for Sustainable Development. I'll hand over to Iveta.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm going to speak mostly about production subsidies, which is clearly the topic of work of our team for the last 10 years, and in particular about the new modeling effort that we have done, and the report that we are going to release by the end of the year. So the main message for today is that production subsidies to the extraction and all related activities for oil, gas, and coal matter for climate, and they should be part of the climate action. At present, what we have, as Michael already pointed out, mixed messages. We have governments trying to put a carbon price, managing demand, and at the same time, often the same governments giving handouts to oil and gas and coal industry to enhance extraction. Then, for the long term, these policies lock in fossil fuel supply, and oil and gas and coal industry operate in capital scarce environments. So once you have investment made, operating costs of running it are relatively low, so it will continue to operate, damaging the climate. And the third argument is obviously from production subsidies you have increased emissions, and this is a part of the equation which we haven't looked so far in more detail. Again, a lot of work has been focusing on consumption subsidies, and that's what I'm going to talk about in more detail. So the next slide is for you to try to guess which country I come from. It's not for you to read the small font because it's impossible, but the idea is to show that when we talk about production subsidies, we talk about legal definitions, and mostly the WTO definition, and there are a lot of types of fossil fuel production subsidies. It's not just direct transferred from government budgets, which is the smallest nesting doll, which a lot of people think about. It's also tax breaks, it's relief on royalties, it's government provided infrastructure, it's loans and guarantees which are provided at below market rates, income and market support. So there are a lot of forms of those. And when we talk about production subsidies, it's important to use the legal definition, which in the WTO has been agreed by 64 countries, because it can get traction also in the bureaucratic processes. So what happens when governments provide fossil fuel subsidies? We argue that these subsidies create zombie energy, and this is the energy which would not be viable to extract without fossil fuel subsidies on the production side. So in this sense, it's a fairly easy assumption. So you provide fossil fuel subsidies, you get more extraction. As a result, you get more supply and lower prices, which then encourage more consumption and more emissions. But when you try to actually understand the quantities, you have to make assumptions. And our modeling has showed that the results of emissions will be very sensitive, first to how subsidies are targeted or mistargeted to marginal fields. Because if they all go to marginal fields, it unlocks a new extraction. If they are captured by fields and projects that are already viable, then it doesn't unlock new production, and it's just recycled by fossil fuel subsidies. And then the second assumption is, of course, the price. So what you do if you remove fossil fuel subsidies? Of course, zombie energy disappears, supply decreases in the short term. And in the short term, you get increase in fossil fuel prices and decrease in consumption. So these are the first order impacts, which are here in the blue color of the Marrakesh Sky, or Sky is the Limit report. But then you also get second order impacts, which are in this slide in the red-brown color of the Marrakesh soil. So what actually happens is that if demand decreases, at some point it will result in higher prices, which will trigger more supply. So in this sense, production subsidy removal has a domino effect on both supply and demand, but it's temporary in nature, and it just gets the system moving in a new way. So all this taken together, the results of our modeling show that from 2017 to 2050, you get 37 gigaton emission reductions from demand response, which is equivalent to 1.1 gigaton per year, or roughly the same as emissions from the aviation sector at present. And you can say it's not that much, but it's not insignificant, and it makes production subsidy reform an important option on the table for climate action. This estimate from our side is based on the inventory, which first was started by OECD and then OCI and ODI with Global Subsidies Initiative, tried to expand it to G20 countries. So we extrapolated based on this data. This data set is incomplete. We need more and better bottom-up inventories, information about production subsidies, information and data to support our assumptions to understand the impacts. But at the same time, by no way production subsidy is a single important measure. Rather, what is important is that other campaigns, other policies can use production subsidy numbers and show that this is waste of money and use these very conservative financial arguments to support action. And I'd like to conclude on a positive note. So Michael already mentioned the moratorium in China. So in case if you're wondering where the term zombie energy comes from, it comes from China, because China now has a lot of zombie companies, generally oversupply in many sectors. And for them, again, this financial argument of wasting money is something that can help maybe extend and replicate this so far temporary moratorium on new coal plants. There is a moratorium in Indonesia on new coal mines. There is a moratorium, a similar moratorium in India. And in the country where I come from, in Russia, WWF campaigned using our numbers for the temporary moratorium on new Arctic oil. And in September this year, this moratorium was put in place. So the hope is that all these measures which are temporary in nature and which are just tests at the moment can become later permanent, and we very much look forward to production subsidies to play a role in this.
Fantastic. Thank you, Iveta. Just to keep a check on time, I'm going to quickly move environment. Over to you, Pete.
Okay, hello. Well, I'm going to talk about another example of possible policy approach to addressing fossil fuel supply. We just heard about fossil fuel producer subsidy reform. I'm going to talk about the idea that Greg first introduced of a moratoria on new fossil fuel production infrastructure. And I'm going to use the case of the United States, actually, because this approach has been tried, at least as far as this temporary moratorium on new coal production from federal lands goes. So the US is a very interesting place to look, not only because it has the largest undeveloped coal reserves, as Greg said, but also because much of the fossil fuel production in the US comes from public-owned, federally owned lands and waters. 40% of coal, about a fifth of oil, and about a sixth of gas, or about a quarter to a third of all fossil fuel production on an energy basis comes from federal lands. So this chart starts off this, this conversation with the history of that, going back 1990 on the far left. The present is about in the middle of this chart. And you can see this big rise in US fossil fuel production. This is all coal and oil and gas combined, by the way. In exajoules on the left axis. The total CO2 associated with this is about 4 billion tons back in the early years, and about 5 or 6 billion tons in the later years. In any case, the big growth in tight oil and gas fracking in the US led to this growth in US fossil fuel production in recent years, and one that's likely to continue growing out in later years, at least according to current Department of Energy forecasts. So what is the role of new leases in this future production? If the US government was to say, as we'll hear about even more from the next speaker, because there's been a bill, the Keep It in the Ground Act, proposed in both the Senate and the House, that would cease issuance permanently of leases, federal leases for new oil, gas, and coal. So if that were to be enacted, if the temporary moratorium that is currently in place were to be extended, this chart shows what might happen out over time. And that blue bit at the top is what fuels are in these leases that have not yet been issued. So just in principle, that could lead to US fossil fuel production peaking, in the 2025 or so in this chart, and then declining thereafter. Now, one way to look at this is, is this consistent with a 2-degree pathway? Does it put the US on a trajectory that would be closer to that? And so to get a sense of that, we overlaid, well, what might a 2-degree pathway for fossil fuel production look like? And I just want to point out for a second, that's a pretty new concept, actually. Most of the time when we see charts like this, it's about consumption or actual emission, use of the fuels. This is about the carbon contained in the fuels that are produced. And so if you take that 1,000 gigaton, or now it's 850, as we heard from Greg, carbon budget, and you distribute it around the world according to who can produce the fuels the cheapest, and you draw the line for the US on this chart, this is what you get. We have a range because we put 2 different studies on here. But as you can see, not only would US emissions be expected to decline as we would expect, so would US fossil fuel production, and a moratoria like this could help start putting the US at least being closer to being on that pathway. Another question you might ask, and that frankly is one of the biggest criticisms of action on the supply side, is, well, if it doesn't come from the Powder River Basin in Wyoming, or whatever fuels you're not going to extract because of some policy, it'll just come from somewhere else, 1 for 1, no big deal, why bother? Well, that's not what we found in our modeling. We've looked really deep into the economics of coal, oil, and gas markets. This chart just shows what we found for coal in particular. So the bar on the far left is how much coal would be left, quote, in the ground in 2030, measured in carbon terms. And yeah, some of it does come back. The next bar shows what coal would be produced and fill in that gap because coal becomes a little more expensive when you limit the supply from the federal sources. So yeah, maybe about half of it in this case anyway, comes back largely from Appalachian sources actually. And because coal is a little more expensive, a little more gas comes back as well to make up the difference. But in the end, there's still a non-trivial effect, 70 million tons of emissions per year in our analysis. When we did the same thing for oil, in other words, modeled a permanent moratorium on new oil, we got up to 100 million tons total. And again, 100 million tons, what's the big deal? It's far less than 1% of global emissions, but it actually is non-trivial in the scale of other things that the US has been doing and looking at. 100 million tons is 600, the biggest policy that the US had been looking at is the Clean Power Plan at 600 million tons. So 100 million tons is on the scale of the other ones that we've looked at. So this could be, in summary, a moratoria could be a real tool for enhancing ambition of countries' targets and policies. And moratoria is just one example. Other approaches could have similar effects. You could put a carbon charge on royalties extraction from federal lands or potentially non-federal lands. You could do something like Michael said at the beginning, do a declining schedule, which actually the Department of Interior has looked at. So there are different ways to approach this question, different ways to look at it, but we think it's worth doing so. So thank you.
Fantastic, thank you, Pete. We're scheduled to have a little moment here where we just kind of have a couple of questions, but I'm really keen to move on to presentations, but just to leave ourselves enough time, because I've got my own questions spinning around in my head, but I'm sure you've got lots of excellent questions for yourself. So I'm actually going to just invite Katie Thomas to come up, who is a policy advisor for energy and environment at the office of US Senator Bernie Sanders. So this is a very topical week for this one. Okay, please welcome Katie. Thank you.
Hi. So it's already been said, I accepted the invitation to come here and be with you today before we received the news that still has me reeling. So you'll have to forgive me for potentially getting emotional, but we're here. So I'd like to start off. We're going to talk a little bit about the Keep It in the Ground Act, which was introduced by Senators Sanders and Merkley with some other co-sponsors last Congress. But I wanted to start off with some good news. So there were a number of local and state ballot initiatives and candidates who were elected. And so I wanted you to know about them. The first one is that we increased the minimum wage in Arizona, Colorado, Maine, and Washington. We defeated an anti-solar ballot initiative in Florida. We banned fracking in Monterey County, California, which is the first major oil producing county that actually was able to ban fracking. And we have 4 women of color in the Senate. So not all is lost. We also legalized marijuana in 4 states. I think it's going to be necessary. Okay, so I serve as the Senator's policy advisor on energy and environment issues. The Keep It in the Ground Act, as was already mentioned, would ban all new federal leases on public lands and waters, so that counts the offshore drilling as well. And then as leases become non-producing, they get expired, and that as they come up for renewal, they don't get renewed. So it would be a slow phasing out of the existing federal leases for oil, coal, and natural gas. Unsurprisingly, the outlook for that is a little dimmer than it was before. But I think what's amazing and has been spoken about as well earlier is that it's now a tangible rallying point for the direct action that we are going to need and that we are going to see. I think that the nonviolent, peaceful civil disobedience and direct action that has already played out in the Keystone XL movement, in the Dakota Access Pipeline movement, et cetera, is definitely something we're going to see. And so I'm hoping that the Keep It in the Ground Act, as we are able to introduce it in the new Congress, will be another rallying cry to do more of this local and state level and international work with all y'all. The other bills that I would just mention you should look into if you're interested are the End Polluter Welfare Act, which was introduced last Earth Day 2 years ago. It bans all fossil fuel subsidies, and that's $110 billion over 10 years. And so we're looking to reintroduce that one in the new Congress as well. I also should have said this at the beginning, but I haven't gotten to speak to my boss since the election results. So just so that's clear, I'm also not speaking on behalf of the federal government or the State Department. Should have said that at the beginning. Yeah. And then other bills that the senator has supported is obviously a price on carbon. We introduced the Climate Protection and Justice Act in December of last year. That would put a price on carbon that is linked to emissions reductions goals instead of the social cost of carbon or any of those things, which would also obviously help push the production side, would have an impact on that market. And then I think going forward, we're going to, again, be working on direct action, but we'll probably be looking into other extraction-related efforts, including a package of law changes and regulation changes that would help us ban fracking in the United States. But I'm happy to answer any questions. Would love to be in touch with people if y'all have any questions about these. And I really appreciate y'all being here today. Take deep breaths, love each other. It's going to be okay. We can do this. Okay. Thank you.
That was great, Katie. Thank you. I think we needed to hear that. Okay, next up is Zipporah Berman, who's adjunct professor at York University's Faculty of Environmental Studies. And in pertinence to today is the co-chair of Alberta government's Oil Sands Advisory Working Group. So I can invite Zipporah to come up and just speak to us about Alberta tar sands. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for convening this very important conversation. I wear a number of hats that I just like to, and I think my work in Alberta and on the Alberta Climate Plan certainly informs my perspective on this work, but I would just like to note that my views today are my personal views. So what's happened in Canada has been extremely interesting over the last year. Many of you probably know we had an election in Alberta that resulted in the first change in administration in 44 years. So we have a far left, a left at least, majority progressive government in Alberta for the first time. And this came at a time when there was already considerable pressure from civil society, not only in Canada, but of course around the world with the Keystone campaign and many other campaigns around the world, to looking at the growth in emissions and the potential for the increase in production from the Alberta oil sands. And so there was already much discussion about the need for climate policy in the province and in the country. And we also, of course, had a change federally in the administration from the Harper administration that, as you know, pulled out of Kyoto, refused to work on climate change, to the Trudeau government, who is, I would say, the Canadian government has been doing a really great job in creating a national conversation in Canada on creating a national energy strategy and climate plan, and has certainly in Paris played a very different role than the Canadian government did in previous COPs. So really the context is ripe in Canada for climate leadership, for new ambition. So what did we see from the Alberta Climate Plan? Introduced in 2015, it includes a complete phase out of coal, a tripling of renewable energy production, an economy-wide carbon tax, and a limit on emission from the oil sands. So it also contains strong energy efficiency plan and a commitment to reduce methane from the oil and gas sector by 45%. These commitments, I think, gave Canada the capacity to create a national methane target. We were working with the US to harmonize that. I hope that continues. And I think that the Alberta Climate Plan was really seen and lauded by many as a historic breakthrough, both on climate policy in a region where previous governments refused to even talk about climate change, but also because we became one of the first oil jurisdictions in the world to legislate a limit on emissions from the oil sands. So part of the reason that I'm here and working with the Stockholm Environment Institute and others to explore these issues, though, is because I really do think that the Alberta Climate Plan is historic leadership. I also think that in the climate era, we know, given the tremendous work by Oil Change and Carbon Tracker and others, that it's insufficient. And that is what we are seeing around the world on climate policy. Historic, frequently, and insufficient. So there are strategies, of course, that we've heard about today to constrain production, removing subsidies, carbon pricing, regulations on methane, on water, on biodiversity. They will drive up costs, and therefore they will constrain production. But we have a time lag. We have a gap. Alberta has put a significant price. Many countries and jurisdictions don't even have a carbon price. We now have a carbon price in Alberta of $20 raising to $30 a ton. Of course, that won't constrain production. It has to be somewhere close to $100 a ton, $120 a ton to really significantly constrain production. So are we really going to rely on the markets to do what we need to do? And if we look at the math, we don't have time. So I think it's really, really critical that we have a conversation about how we create incentives for constraining supply in the system. Because what I saw happening in Alberta and now in Canada and in many other countries is a conversation about how we define fair share, how we define climate leadership. And as long as our accounting systems are based on demand-side accounting, where we don't have any accounting and incentives for the supply side, we're not going to see jurisdictions moving farther. So what I saw in Alberta is increasingly a conversation about, well, this is as far as we can go because we won't be competitive. There will be too much economic disadvantage. There's constantly this conversation around, sure, we recognize climate change, we recognize that we have to reduce emissions, but our job is to meet our NDCs. Well, as we know, in a supply-side producing region, that means you're only accounting for your production emissions. 80% of the emissions from the oil, are when they're burned. So if that's true, then and we define climate leadership as meeting our NDC, which is of course a challenge in and of itself, then ultimately the argument becomes that we all have a right to compete for that shrinking bit of fossil fuels. Everyone has a right to compete for it. It is the ultimate tragedy of the commons, and we can't allow that to happen. So I would say that given this new analysis, I agree with you, Michael, we need new systems, we need new international agreements, we need financial incentives to leave carbon in the ground. Domestically, I think it's very clear no-go areas and moratoria are certainly possible, and the calls that we've seen from civil society create the social license for that. But I think national and sub-regional governments need to be held to account. And that means that the process here and other international processes need to create an accounting system. We need to create a race to the top. We need to create tracking and some peer pressure, some new expectations that define climate leadership. Thought we're talking about bridging the gap between the infrastructure that we build and our climate ambitions. And that has been a massive problem in Canada and in many other countries. And how do we align that? I think we saw the beginnings of a great idea from President Obama when he proposed the climate test for Keystone XL. But I think if that's going to work, what we need is a climate test that ensures that all countries at a national and at a sub-regional level, when they're evaluating projects, any infrastructure projects, any developments of new mines, new oil reserves, that analysis has to be done looking at global market economic scenarios that are equivalent with our level of climate ambition of 1.5. Every country does global market economic analysis to look at a project. Right now, they do it with business as usual economic scenarios, and we know those are 6-degree scenarios. A 6-degree scenario is an uninhabitable world, and I don't think it's too much to ask for our governments to do global market economic analysis in line with a habitable world. Thank you.
Thank you, Zipporah. And then we're going to hear on the situation in Norway, and we're going to hear from Berit Christoffersen from the Arctic University in Norway, who's going to speak to us about Norway's own hopeful transition away from oil.
Well, it is sort of a sad story, but I'm going to talk about the political geography of Norway's uneven history of oil and gas development and some lessons we can learn from this history in the context of the present challenges in terms of our carbon lock-in and how they are linked to stranded assets in the Arctic. And talk a little bit in the end about transparency as a way of cooling down the petrol state. So I think if we look at Norway, the biggest challenge when it comes to addressing this is the continued licensing for oil and gas exploration, and with this opening new areas to explore for new reserves. Norway peaked its oil production in 2001, its overall production in 2004, followed by a very intense period of investment and exploration activities in the petroleum sector. We doubled the amount of people in the industry. A decade later, we are far off finding enough prospective acreage, as the industry called it, to maintain these production levels. New and more controversial areas are either opened up for companies or are hotly debated about in terms of what is left unexplored. The most intensive exploration pressures are, as you might imagine, in the Norwegian Arctic, and these are either closer to shore or closer to the Arctic ice sheet. The government is actually arguing out of line with the leading scientists at my university and the research community over where the ice cover ends, so to speak, and pushes drilling further north into the Arctic Ocean. And so far, over 130 explorations have taken place in the Barents Sea, resulting in less than a handful potential prospects and 2 field developments, and the state covers 78% of the exploration costs. In a paper I published last year, I addressed this as opportunistic adaptation, defined as the idea that climate change should be benefits should be prioritized over efforts to address the causes. So this is really putting the blinders on, as you talked about, Michael. And as you already know, that we had here with MacLeod and Ekins from Nature last year, the Arctic resources should be left in the ground if we are to reach the 2-degree scenario. And on the prospect of this, and in this context of addressing this specific supply-side policy regarding drilling in the Norwegian Arctic in terms of the last licensing round and the upcoming one, is actually a lawsuit from a number of organizations, a great alliance, where the Norwegian government, for the first time, will need to respond to whether these decisions to open the Arctic Barents Sea for drilling violates the nation's updated constitution and whether it threatens the Paris Agreement. And the government will need to reply to this very soon. And this will be the first time that we're actually over 5 decades as an oil producer will need to defend their petroleum activities in a supply side perspective. However, this is not the first time supply side has been limited politically. This was addressed in the 1970s when the Norwegian Parliament decided that they would keep a moderate pace on its extraction, which included an upper limit of production 90 million oil equivalents per year, and withstanding drilling for more oil if we already know we had enough proven. And we also left more than the Norwegian Arctic, even more as a moratorium because of the fisheries. The expectation, the reasoning behind this was that once oil was found, it would be too tempting to extract it. So while a cap on production is indeed relevant for supply side action, there's actually a lesson to be learned when this was officially abandoned. So the rationale behind creating an oil fund, which you might know about, was not only to create a more flexible economy, it was the fear of stranded assets. As argued by Minister of Industry at the time, Jens Stoltenberg, which is now the head of NATO, a climate deal could kill the value of the oil. The same could happen to the oil as had happened to the coal, he argued, and said that it would be more profitable to pump it up and invest it into global markets. 20 years later, this fund has a size of 150 billion pounds, almost 2% of global market shares, but it's still debating whether 1% should be invested in greener energy, including infrastructures. Norway can follow other countries' pension funds, because that's what it's officially called, who sets an objective for this. This does not only relate to political leadership, but to market developments, as you discussed in Oxford. Tina Saltvedt there said that the green energy infrastructures would be a good investment. And the oil fund had in 2015 367 billion crowns invested in fossil fuel companies and infrastructures, including the 3 companies responsible for the pipeline at Standing Rock. And the indigenous population in Norway, the Samis, are really standing up for this now. And the government is, as I told you, taking the financial risk of all these new explorations. And so it's a good example of the difficulties of becoming a fossil fuel dependent country, but also an example of how some supply side action can be taken if we look at the history. And on a final note, I would like to mention the carbon risks implemented into business models would then show more transparency for investments and others. And I'm thinking here also with this argument that we have in Norway that you talked about in the States, that we have this limited amount left and it's better that we do it than other countries who emit more than us. This has actually been, by very good journalism, been exposed to not be true. So this lack of numbers and knowing the numbers, knowing the risks, really putting a number on the risk, I think would really help. So thank you.
Many thanks, Berit. So we've got maybe 20, 25 minutes for some question and answers. And I understand that we've got some microphones going around, but while they just get ready, it struck me listening to all the speakers that, you know, as a journalist myself, I'm always looking at these policy dilemmas, and what always kind of rises to the top in many ways are the unintended consequences and the paradoxes and the dilemmas when you try and create and squeeze policy solutions. I was struck by, particularly in Avetta's presentation about this, the paradox of if you squeeze and put pressure on subsidies, you squeeze on one side, it might in the mid to longer term cause exactly the opposite result of what you require. I just would like to ask if 2 or 3 of the speakers would just like to raise some of the other unintended consequences, perhaps in the regions where they work. One I was particularly thinking of is, and it's super topical this week, is the idea of sort of unjust and disorderly transitions. You could argue, I guess, in some states in the US that it was this what many voters led towards Trump, this kind of move away, this kind of in the deindustrialization of some of those states. It was these people some of those voters in those states latched onto what Trump was saying. So how do we avoid some of those issues arising as we move away from fossil fuels? Would anyone like to, okay. Just to check, yeah, you've all got microphones, haven't you? Yeah?
No, I think it's already on.
Okay.
I would like to say that I think that what is really critical is that we're clear domestically which conversation we're having. Are we having a conversation about managed decline and getting off fossil fuels? Because I think in a lot of producing regions, we're not. And that can lead to unintended consequences, especially relative to planning for just transition. Because what I'm seeing in Canada is that because the bar is being set as meeting our NDC, the industry is very much arguing that we're greening fossil fuels, that the goal is to reduce production emissions, and that could mean that in the future we can increase production as long as we reduce production emissions. And so it's almost impossible with governments to have a conversation about managed decline because they're not clear yet that climate leadership means managed decline. So are we greening fossil fuels or are we getting off fossil fuels? It sounds almost crazy here in Marrakesh to be saying that, but I think at a sub-regional and at a national level, that is the essential question that needs to be answered in order to ensure that we're all on the same page and planning for the same thing.
Okay, Katie?
I think, is this on? Yeah, can y'all hear me? Oh, okay. I think your question kind of went to how do we prevent a backlash from the communities who feel disenfranchised and underrepresented and who latched onto a candidate like Trump. And I think it's to engage those communities directly, to look them in the face and say, I see you. Another way to do it, and what I hope that our movement will continue to focus on, is looking at the communities of color and low-income communities around the world who are going to be hit first and worst by these tragedies, and have them help us figure out what are the best ways forward to ensure that we have a transition that really is just and really does help grow our economy. One note, I'm not sure whether this is relevant, and I think we'll continue to hear about it, but in Washington State, there was a price on carbon on the ballot, and several environmental organizations actually moved away from it because of the lack of stakeholder engagement up front. And so I think that's why it failed. I think in big part why there wasn't enough real grassroots support around it. And I think that's a really important story that's as old as time. When we tried to fight the logging industry in Oregon to protect the spotted owl, we should have been engaging the workers. We should have been working for a solution that engaged the people whose lives were at stake. And I absolutely think we must do that in anything that we do going forward.
Barrett, do you have something?
Yeah, I totally agree with what was said. And before I started my PhD, I worked on CCS, and it's only 2% of the total emissions come from the production. So we need to work in the other end. And just tagging on to what the others said, and I think we need to look at the futures in the making. We need to go into these communities. We need to talk about what's a viable future for you. What's a sustainable future look like? Not just talk about low emission society, because that also gives recognition both to what futures people want, but also that climate change needs to be taken action from the bottom up and top down at the same time.
Okay, fantastic. So I'd love to open it up to the floor now. I mean, as ever, if we can keep questions to 1 or 2 sentence questions and not people making points, that would be fantastic, because we are pretty tight on time. So this gentleman here in the middle, thank you.
Thank you, John Huntley. I now work for the Forest Stewardship Council, but in my previous job, head of the European Environmental Bureau, I was lobbied a lot by the Norwegian government to be positive about carbon capture and storage. It was just mentioned as a way to green the fossil industry. And I just wanted to know, 10 years beyond that, how realistic is carbon capture and storage in terms of also economically feasible, in terms of at least dealing with centralized production? I mean, because now the focus is on keeping it in the ground. I think that is the wisest way to do. But the argument has been for a while, we can bring it back into the ground, the greenhouse gas emissions at least.
Well, that's a great question. Does anyone want to take on the subject of carbon capture and storage, and perhaps even more widely than that, the kind of new issue that came out of the IPCC and Paris deal was this kind of idea of negative emissions, that we can go later in the century and rely on these kind of magical technologies in some ways to suck all of this CO2 out of the atmosphere and bury it. Who would like to take on that question? Okay.
Sure. I'll make a brief comment on it. I'd say there are 2 things to bear in mind. The first is that it's an unproven technology. It exists in a few pilot projects around the world, and we don't know whether it will work out or not. And so it would be extremely unwise to depend on it working out as the only means to stay within climate limits. In fact, right now, there's a bit of a pulling back from CCS. I'm thinking of the 4 European utilities who pulled out of the EU CCS scheme last year, the UK government's withdrawal of funding, the US government's pulling back from the Future Gen project and so on, and even advocates like Shell saying this will only work with massive subsidies. So the first point is we don't really know, but it would be unwise to rely on it. And I think the second point is that even if CCS does work out, it will be a small part of the picture. I think the real dishonesty of some in the fossil fuel industry and elsewhere is to imply that CCS is the solution and doesn't require action to downscale our extraction and use of fossil fuels. If it does work out, and that's a huge if, it will only somewhat reduce the amount by which we've got to decrease dependence on fossil fuels. It's by no means, even in a best case, a panacea.
Yep, sure.
Can I just add one thing to that? I agree with everything Greg just said, but I would say that I have spent some time in facilities in Alberta and BC, one which is the ShellQuest project, which is a large-scale CCS project on oil production. And you know, it sequestered 1 million tons last year. So it's starting, but the fact is, I do agree that it would be unwise to rely on that, and it's enormously expensive. It's not commercially viable unless you're, again, at close to $100 a ton for a price of carbon. And I think the idea that we would be allowing public financing of these projects is simply wrong. We need public dollars to be going into low carbon solutions, to be going into viable renewable technologies and public transit, et cetera, in order to move to 100% renewables. But there is also an air sequestration project which came online in Canada just last year, and you know, I have to say that I think we do need all hands on deck, given the challenges that are facing us. And the idea that you could stand there and watch from a beautiful place like Squamish that isn't even near a coal plant, the facility sucking carbon out of the air and carbon pellets coming out the bottom that are solid, you know, was kind of exciting. But again, it's not viable till about $110 a ton. So these are just experimental projects, and we need to focus on what we know. And what we know is that renewables at scale are possible and safer, and that should be where our public dollars go.
Okay, thank you, Greg, for it. One more question. This gentleman over here with the white shirt.
Hi, I'm Pierre Kühne from Lingo, the Leave It in the Ground initiative. As we go towards the end of the fossil age, like we end this whole craziness we're living in these days, there will be different moments, and oil prices will go up and down, and different moments are good for different things. Right now, fossil fuel prices are so low that it's a very good moment to be questioning these projects and shutting them down. My question is, once oil prices go up again, what mechanisms can we have put in place before that make it impossible to open up the Arctic again, and all those projects that are not now falling off the table but will be coming back once prices are high again? Thanks.
Okay, good question. Iveta, is that one you want to take on?
It's again about a package of measures. So we cannot talk about fossil fuel supply without thinking about alternatives coming from renewables. And I think at the moment we have low prices and have certain moratoria that buy out time for new technologies, new solutions. And the longer low oil prices continue, of course, the better in the sense. In our modeling, again, with fossil fuel production subsidy removal, we assumed high oil prices because that's what the IEA does. So they think that by 2050 prices will go up to 145 dollars per barrel. So if fossil fuel prices are low, like from production subsidy removal alone, you get 4 or 5 times as much emission reductions as if they go up.
Okay, gentleman down here.
Hello, my name is Lukas Stein, University of Hamburg. My question is, how much of the investment that is bound in fossil fuel assets is covered below a foreign direct investment protection? And could these frameworks actually prevent us from leaving the fossils?
Okay, Yvette.
Well, we have the number from the ODI-OCI report, which looks at public finance, mostly export finance, and last year it was $88 billion.
Okay, Katie.
That's why my boss opposes the Import-Export Bank, is because of how we use public dollars to ensure investment in fossil fuels infrastructure abroad.
Okay, any more hands? Lady over on the side there.
Thank you. As a student from the United States, I'm finding it pretty hard to believe that any sort of national or international cooperation on climate change is actually going to be viable in the next 4 years. So my question is, in terms of community and state level action on supply side sort of approaches to fossil fuels, what besides say moratoriums, state level moratoriums and other initiatives like that, would you see as actually viable in terms of approaching the supply side issue?
Katie?
I don't know what you mean by moratoriums, just like on fossil fuel extraction, because another example would be in Portland, Oregon, they put a moratorium on all new fossil fuel infrastructure. So not like gas stations, but oil trains and pipelines and that kind of thing. I think the water protection, some of the local water protection efforts are actually getting at coal mining or fracking. I also think, again, with the positive, helping get your state renewable portfolio standard, helping incentives at the state level. I think there's a lot of hope. I think that's where we're going to have to keep our focus, is at the state and local level, and watch how these resilient communities are doing amazing things. And speaking of resiliency, that would be another one, investing in adaptation and resiliency infrastructure, emergency planning, that kind of thing, as communities are going to have to work together to literally weather the extreme weather events that we're going to see.
Should we have Michael, Sephora, and then Barrett?
The state and local is a tough one. It's a tough one because when you're talking supply side, you're talking certain states and communities that are probably less inclined to take some of these measures as well. But there's a signal question here, back to the Paris signal. And the need for a signal is even greater than before. And if you look particularly at oil and increasingly gas, but particularly oil is an international commodity with an international price. And it's only going to go up if demand goes up in the rest of the world and there's signals that we're committed to oil. And if other nations can band together and send a strong signal to the US that we're interested in moving away from oil, then states like North Dakota, who are facing financial crises, might think twice about doubling down their own infrastructure investment and betting their futures on a robust oil market, but rather one that maybe stays at $50 or $60 for some time, as many think it could. So it's really important to send that signal and think creatively that the whole world can contribute to sending this signal. So thanks.
Okay, Sephora?
So two things. One is any strategy which delays the build out of infrastructure, which buys us time, are absolutely critical at this moment in history. I mean, delays are our friend because we know the price of renewables is dropping, ambition is increasing, etc. And so we're actually seeing great leadership at a state level and at a city level in the United States, especially on the West Coast. Every single oil train terminal that is being proposed stopped by local and regional initiatives. Coal exports stopped by local and regional initiatives, because those governments have tremendous leeway. This is very popular and with the public. And so I think those are really important. Any initiative which addresses water and toxins is going to increase price. Again, that is going to do some work to constrain production. But I also think we need to start looking at land protection. Separate from moratoria and coal or oil, simply land protection. Where are those sweet spots where you have overlaps, where it is, in India, it's tiger habitat, happens to be a big coal deposit under that. The public's very supportive of protecting tiger habitat. In Canada, we have endangered species, caribou, that are on some of the, big oil and gas leases. Land protection in the right place is absolutely critical, and that can constrain future production.
Okay, we probably have enough time for maybe a couple of other questions. Gentleman at the back.
Corporate bioenergy, I find question, wouldn't be one successful strategy against supply side investment if many countries introduce a high carbon tax on fossil fuels emissions? For instance, €100 per ton CO2 emissions, then the demand for fossil fuels would decline, and many people don't dare anymore to invest in fossil fuel infrastructure.
Pete, okay.
Yeah, I don't think anybody would disagree with that. I mean, that's the best case in the sense, because it drives a wedge between the supply and demand curves, has a high price for consumers but a low price for producers. But I think many of the initiatives we're talking about are taking place in a world where we don't have a carbon price at the level that you're probably imagining.
I think what's really critical is that in many jurisdictions, political acceptability of a higher carbon tax is very low. And so you're going to get the price high enough, I think, to constrain production in many jurisdictions is not going to be possible in the time that we have to keep the world below 2 degrees. And we have to face that, and we have to therefore recognize that we're going to need other regulatory measures to constrain carbon.
Okay, there was a question just on the aisle, and then we'll go to the gentleman on the side.
Thanks. I'd like to take one risk out of the table, and that is the return to a high oil price and what kind of implications it would have. And here I start with your statement, or you referred to this carbon price initiative, carbon tracker initiative statement that two-thirds of the oil wells, for instance, will remain in earth unburned. What would it mean for the largest oil producers and sellers in the Middle East? It would be optimal for them to sell the largest share they ever can sell of their wells, and crowd out by a low price the Arctic oil, the Brazil deep sea oil. And in my view, this is exactly what is happening. The Gulf oil producer countries, they are well aware of this carbon tracker initiative statements and this discussion. The United Arab Emirates, they have already half officially stated that they don't expect oil to be an important source of revenues in 2050. That is, it's optimal for them to keep the price low and crowd out the more expensive sources of oil.
Okay, great.
I think if we look at the history of the last 40 or 50 years among the oil producers in the Middle East, what you repeatedly see is that when the oil price is low, they all talk about economic diversification. And when it's high, they forget what they just said about it when it was low. I think we do have a real challenge with how do we as a climate movement address them, or where is the political solution here? I think one interesting possibility to me is whether OPEC could play a role in facilitating this transition in the way that OPEC played a role in facilitating the transition from foreign control of their oil industries to national control of their oil industries in the 70s via its secretariat, via cooperation between them. Clearly what is needed there is real economic diversification. What we've heard over the last 2 years is a lot more talk of it, but that very much fits the pattern that I just described. Could I just add something on that first question you asked, Leo, about just transition, which is just an advertisement that the ITUC is doing a side event tomorrow on just transition at 11 o'clock. I'm afraid I don't know the venue off the top of my head, so you'll have to look it up, but I would really encourage people to go to that.
Okay, we've got maybe time for one very quick question and maybe one response, and then we'll conclude. So this gentleman on the side.
Hello, Adam from Citizens Climate Lobby, Sweden. So we're talking about the fact that we need a strong, effective financial incentive. And we also say that the difficulty is political here. There are political difficulties that don't make that happen. So what about having a carbon tax that is steadily rising, a carbon fee, and that we divide its revenues and return the revenues directly to households in purpose to create that political acceptance? Your comments on that, please.
Okay, Iveta, then probably maybe if we can just do Iveta, then Katie quickly, and then we'll conclude.
I think it's one of the options that people can discuss. It will come down to institutions in particular countries actually being able to implement a fair distribution of such additional revenue, because you can do possibly something like this in Sweden. In countries with poor institutions, it will be much more difficult.
So I'm sure you're familiar, CCL has a model that Remy has that gives all the financing back, and Republic N, that's the group led by Bob Inglis, former congressman in the United States, is also another group that's working on to build conservative support for price on carbon by making it revenue neutral. I would encourage you to look at my boss's recent carbon tax. It starts at, I think, $15 a ton and goes all the way up to $72 a ton slowly over time, and then returns 80% of the money back to families in a way that disproportionately favors the low-income families. And then there's $20 billion a year that we spend on a climate justice resiliency fund to help adaptation and mitigation efforts, or sorry, adaptation and resiliency efforts, and a couple of other like energy efficiency and some ag incentives. But I still think we're going to be working on other stuff to get a package of little things done. I think that's where my head is at right now.
Okay, thank you. So just another quick reminder before we leave that tomorrow at 5 o'clock in the Green Zone, there is a side event on the equity question. Obviously, it's been touched upon here, but it's obviously another huge component within this big subject. And another reminder that we've now got refreshments being served, I think out of that door, just around to the side. Yep. Just wanted to obviously just say a huge thank you to today's wider range of speakers. And thank you again for a packed room, but some great questions and really fantastic to see you all here. So thank you very much.